Don McLean, who curated this evening's program, will moderate this evening's roundtable discussion with Merrill Mundell, Sally Mundell, Julie Potter, and Andy Burrows. After the roundtable, he will speak about Mundell's poetry and read 25 of his poems with commentary. So I am happy to turn this over to Don.
Thank you, Sandy. Thanks. Can't thank enough Brooks Memorial Library. When I was in here yesterday setting up the exhibit, which, by the way, don't forget to look at, there was obviously a person from out of town because it was tourist season. And as he left the library, he said to the person who was with, this is really a nice library. And I felt like going, yeah, this really is a nice library. It's just so great working here. Every time I wanted a pencil or a pair of scissors or whatever, it was in my hand immediately. So I really thank Star and the whole wonderful staff here. And I'm going to be talking later quite a bit when I read you the poems and talk about them. So I really want to get quickly to these panelists. We have Merrill Mundell Jr., who's a nephew of William Mundell, his wife Sally. Julie Potter, who is a niece, grandniece, of course, I should have said. And Andy Burrows over here, who was working at the Stephen Green Press when they published Bill Mundell's first book. And so I'm going to start with the family, and I'm pretty much tempted just to let them talk without my even asking questions, but I will try to if I need to. But I wanted to just get going with the family. Any kind of recollections, or when you were young and you had this uncle who, I'm still interested in the fact that he was he wrote such really wonderful poetry. And so my sort of beginning question was, what was it like to have him in the family? What did you think about the fact that he was writing poetry, which he did in addition to all the other stuff that a Vermont person would have been doing in those days? And it's just an interesting perception I thought you could share with us.
We had pretty interesting fellow as an uncle anyway. I said, we had a pretty interesting fellow as an uncle anyway. And the fact that he wrote poetry was just one of the things he did. It wasn't what you would call extraordinary or anything. It was just part of what we did, that's all. We got a lot of exposure to it. As a example, we would ride to Rutland Fair many, many years. And there'd be rules. You couldn't talk in the car unless you spoke in rhyme. So it cut the chatter down, but it made it interesting, and you learned a little bit once in a while. And he would, if you cheated, he would call you on it. So it was that sort of stuff. In my early years, he was just a figure, part of the family. He went into the military as the Marine Corps, and he went there when I was about 4, something like that. So I didn't remember much, except the thing I did remember, and I think it's something we all need to take to heart, is we would go down to my grandparents' house, 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock 10 o'clock at night to 1 o'clock in the morning, because we had a shortwave radio and we could get Australia, which was the latest news from the war front, which he was in the Pacific Theater. Never knew where he was. He was flying aircraft on the top secret radar. And we never knew basically what he did. It was one of those things you didn't talk about, and he never talked about it, ever. What he actually did was something that we never learned. But he was proud of what he did, and I think he did a good job. As we went along, we realized that the skiing was a bigger part of his life than I had first realized when he was in the military. He went into the military after he had started ski area. He started ski area in Brattleboro on the Hamilton farm. That didn't have snow. There was some snow, but not enough. And so he and my dad went to all the hills they could find here in local Windham County and a little bit in Bennington County. And they did measurements of the snowpack, of the cold, the temperature, how long the snow stayed. And they finally figured out that the best snow around was in Woodford. So he purchased what was then known as Prospect Mountain. This back to Prospect Mountain ski area now. He didn't call it Prospect Mountain. He called it Mundell Ski Toe. And he did a tremendous amount of work trying to put together what the ownership of that property was. There were its tales, and the lady who owned it didn't really know what she owned. She had really very little idea. There were no such things as town tax maps at that point. And if you didn't know what you owned, you were at the mercy of your neighbor. But he put it together, and he purchased the entire tract from her. He didn't need any more. It was right out to the road. And the whole front face of the mountain was turned into a ski area. He didn't have the wherewithal to do a ski area that went to the top of the hill. So his ski toe went about halfway up. The ski trails were about a little bit more than a third, because you had to have some room to clear the rope and the engine before you started skiing down the hill. But World War II and the draft, he decided he would enlist in the Marine Corps. And that put the end to his maintaining the ski area. So when he came back, then I was beginning to be old enough to help, and we could go over there. Myself and my buddies and my brother, her dad, would go over, and we would pack the hill by hand, sidestepping the hill. And we had some really strong legs, but we could ski all we wanted to after we got it packed. And you could make a trip down once in a while, because you could go, you'd pack up, you wouldn't pack down. So we had a pretty good time doing that sort of stuff. I'm just kind of going through a list that I've got here. He after the service, he and my grandmother did quite a bit of investing in land. They developed some places. They bought and sold land, and there's lots of places around here that you probably know about that he has owned and sold or whatever. He got the best of Link Haynes once, and that was a good deal. They bought a piece of land that linked to a shore ledge, and it was gravel. So it was that was a big star. My grandmother especially. He worked on the road. He was a grader operator, although he didn't care for that so much. He liked to do the maintenance. He liked to do the brush cutting. He liked to do that sort of stuff. And he did that for quite a few years after my grandfather retired. My grandfather had done it over 30 years. So, the Rutland Fair, as I mentioned before, was one of the things that we tried to do a lot. But just to give you an idea of how his mind worked, we were at the fair, and we all agreed we were going to meet at the car at about 8 o'clock, I think it was. It might have been 7. Anyway, no bill. And no bill. And then probably half hour too late, later than we'd agreed to, here he comes with a pile of blankets you wouldn't believe. And we said, what happened? Well, it just so happened he was walking back, and one of the guys was spinning the roulette wheel, and he was getting tired. And he watched him, and he had a pattern. He developed, this spinner developed a pattern because of his tiredness. So Bill had it figured out where it was going to land next, and he won a ton of blankets. And finally the guy said, Why don't you move along? So, well, it was time to go. But that was the kind of mind he had. He would, if something like that was going on, he could ferret it out usually. He was big with family. He had a lot of fun with family. We would go to picnics or Thanksgiving or Christmas or something like that, and it would be nothing to have him at one end of the table and my cousin Jim at the other end of the table, yelling at one another across the table. Have you got any gravy down there, et cetera, kind of foolishness. But it was just fun stuff. Never saw him do anything that was miserable or mean. He was one of the most giving people you could ever ask for. Mick and a fellow from Dover set up a little construction company between classes during the summertime, and Bill let them use his equipment, and they had a grand time. They made good money at it, and I don't think they paid him much more than enough to pay for fuel and any repairs that were necessary. So it was just, that was the kind of guy he was. He just was really, really kind to him. So I'll pass it to Julie here if she's got memories.
Okay. Well, Uncle Bill was always, and we always called him Uncle. He wasn't my great Uncle Bill. We always called him Uncle Bill. Up until, I saw him regularly up until I was about probably 14 or 15, moody, angsty teenage girl took over at that point. But the things that I do remember, I think first off, my middle name is May after his mom. So that was Flora May. And so, I always had this connection. And yeah, it's true. He really did. Family was really was a big deal for him. When I was a kid, we would go over to Chesterfield to Uncle Jim's house, and that was where we would have Thanksgiving. It was like all the cousins and all the people, and there was a lot of goodness and friendliness, and always Uncle Bill and Jim. I do remember that duo quite well. It was sort of legendary. And talking about his giving, I remember, and I can't remember how old I was, but I was probably 10 or 11. And there's a barn on the Brookside property, which is, where he grew up and where he lived. And he had something he wanted to give me up in the barn. And I was like, what the heck could that be? And in the barn, there were two desks. One was a mission style standing desk that the top came down and it had all the little compartments in it. I don't even remember the other desk, because he said to me, he goes, you're old enough now. Why don't you pick which desk you want? You can take it home and you can refinish it and you can, do what you want with it. And so obviously I picked the mission style desk because which is sitting in our great room right now. But he really, that was a really monumental kind of moment. I felt really like, wow, I have some autonomy here. I got to choose something. And he recognized that, that's a big deal. He also, probably, I might have been a little bit older. He gave me a book of Arthurian legends, and it was pretty dense. It was thick, and the text was small, and I kind of was like, oh boy, this is pretty big. And I didn't read it then, but I came back to it later, and it there was probably 3 years where I spent all kinds of time taking books out of this library at UVM, and doing a lot of reading about that kind of thing. And he just had a way of knowing kind of what was going to spark somebody. I did grow up knowing that he was a published author, which, I thought was pretty cool. John and I had my dad read one of his poems at our wedding, so this kind of thread of Uncle Bill always being there. My brother found online somewhere an old poster for Mundell Skeeto, and he had it framed, and he has that at his house. So it really, like I said, that thread really continues to run through our family. And so it's really kind of neat to be here again. And I was thumbing through, we have the books at home, and I was thumbing through them, and I was surprised. Like, I haven't thought about some of these poems in so long, but there were some I was like, I remember that poem, and some of the ones that you're going to read tonight, Dawn. And I guess that makes me realize just sort of how much it impacted my childhood, and obviously it's carried through to my adulthood, and here I am. So, he was really interesting, and very artistic, and he would play these mind games with you, like these quiz games, and he'd ask you these questions, and you weren't sure if he was being serious or if he wasn't being serious. But in the end, he was really trying to sort of like get you to think, which maybe when you were saying that about having to be in the car and speaking in rhyme. So I think that was more my experience. I wasn't locked in a car with him, but he was definitely quizzing me. So, which was, that was always, as a kid, it felt very like, uh-oh, but, I can recognize it now for really what it was. He was really interested, in people, in his family, but in people and the way they thought. And I think that, that comes out in his poetry also, in people, how they live and what they think about and what's important to them. So I think that's what's coming off the top of my head.
Well, thank you. I think we should bring Sally in on this. She has some stuff she's prepared, I think, to talk about.
Can you hear me? Good. Okay. So I endorse all the things that you've heard so far, because I saw them too. But the other day I came across a letter that he had written to me from Arcadia. And some of you may notice that my car number plate is Sally Forth. And so he addressed this letter to Dear Sally Forth. So with the S on it, that must include him in the family. And this was written in March of '86. And he says, I was prompted by your inspirational letter to dash off how my skeleton was injured. And that was the first that we knew he'd had an accident. So he numbered the poem as number 5. Maybe that was the 5th revision, I don't know. But he goes on to say, it's as good an explanation for an accident occurring at 9 o'clock in the morning on an ambitious morning. Hunk sure knows how a fellow hurts. Just to think of riding a horse makes me cringe. I'm actually lucky to be using a walker so soon. It wasn't the doctor's idea, but he finally went along with it. I demonstrated how I could pick up the walker and with one hand and point it down the hall with it. Like the old farmer, when the tourist asked the directions to pick up, he picked up the plow he was leaning on and pointed west. It took me 2 days to get enough nerve to mount a bedpan, say nothing about a horse. The mockingbirds are here asking for grapes. The quail are back, and we were afraid the new house next door might bother them, but I guess not. I'm waiting for time to make the difference. So that's the explanation of what's coming. So this is number 5, how my skeleton was injured. The devil did it. He snapped his fingers and broke my pelvis in 2 places. He was angry because I dared to hold pure Clorox under his nose and scrub his milkweed chin with a stiff brush. I did have him choking, But he was angry because I stood 2 feet shorter than he in smooth sole leather shoes, 2 steps up on a wimply ladder. I didn't care to meet him face to face. I wasn't showing off. I was coming down anyway. He pushed me when no one was looking, not even I. He tried to make it seem like an accident. I scared him when I summoned 5 city road workers and 2 rescue men in a red and white ambulance to bring me round to the local hospital care to suffer the devil's own fare attendant there too. And that's the story of when he fell off a wobbly ladder. Another example would be when our younger son was at probably 2nd or 3rd grade, and he was learning that some words sound the same when you pronounce them, but they mean something totally different, as in minute and minute, or similar things like that. So he responded, but not the way you might think. And actually, the book that this poem is from is The Fun of Hollowing, his last one, his last edition, last collection of poems. Pot is stop, ward is draw, dog is God, was is saw. A star for rats, one is now. Room is more, wow is wow, edit, the tide, way is yaw, tort is trot, raw starts war. Madam, in reverse, it's I'm Adam, kayak is kayak, logger is regal, tab changes to bat, Taws switches to SWAT, and Pat turns to tap. And it goes on. And if you look at this book on page number 60, you can find it there. Another example of what Julie was mentioning was our family get-togethers and the fun we had. But also, he respected people very much and often went to an extreme that some people wouldn't think of to answer an interest or to inspire you, if you were the recipient, to think of it in a different angle, a different way. And one year, our older son was just about to go into the Coast Guard. And evidently he thought that was the time to share a family revolver, right? Pistol.
My grandmother had always had a Ivor Johnson 22 revolver in her drawer. And when she died, he didn't think that was the thing he wanted to keep in the house in the drawer. So it was around the house, mostly in that same drawer, but nobody was using it. And our son Walter, when he was probably just learning to drive, because I had to take him to the shooting range early on, and he drove himself. He became a very expert marksman with the 30-06, and he's actually nationally ranked 7th. So that was part of it. So he knew that Walter was a rifleman or was a firearms expert, and so that leads into this.
So on page 19 in the Book of Common Hours, you find the Christmas gun. Too grown for toys. His gift was real, was black, the weight of steel, yet light as fire. as dangerous to touch. It forced all childish things back into innocence. Now he can learn his right to take, to sight at bird or buck, or following some rousing drum. He may, in drawing one small finger back, blow all his Christmases to kingdom come.
That's a really good one.
Painting was another thing that he did, and his mother gave us a painting for a Christmas, for a wedding gift. But one Christmas, Bill gave us a painting he had done. What he did not know was that my grandmother on my maternal side used to pick blueberries on the floating island over in Whitingham. And this painting had the floating island of Whitingham in it. And it hangs on our wall now. I don't know how he knew, but he had this extra sense of knowing about people and what could help them enjoy life better, become more useful citizens. And I think I'll let other
Thank you.
people talk now.
And I should mention, I hope you'll all look at this exhibit we put together, and the slideshow you see in progress there is some of Bill Mundell's photographs, a very small number of the total number of slides that these folks have in their possession. So take a look at those. And he did have a coverage in Life magazine, a photo that's a kind of a collage he put together with the ice crystals on horses together. And there's a copy of that Life magazine on the table. So I thought that with the mention of books, this would be a good introduction to get Andy Burroughs involved here. And in approaching 1970, when he was already almost 60 years old, which is a little bit late in life to be publishing your first book of poems, he worked with the Stephen Green Press, which published the first 3 of his books. And it was the demise of the Stephen Green Press that actually caused his final 3 books to be published other places. But Andy here was a well-known, he's known as a publisher in town for many decades. You may have read in the in-print book his story of ProLingua, the company that he ran for many years until retiring recently. And but earlier in his career, he worked for the Stephen Green Press, which was a wonderful Brattleboro institution, started in the basement of the bookseller, as I recall, and then moved to its own facility. So I thought I'd get Andy to tell us about his work at SGP during that period and how you became aware of William Mundell and got involved in working on his first book, Hill Journey.
Well, reflecting on what I can share about my experience with Bill Mundell, I got thinking about how it all worked with Jan and Steve Green, who were dear friends of mine. I came and had been working with them for about 4 years by 1970. And they were wonderful, warm, brilliant people. And they kindly included me in most of their discussions as to what we should publish and how we should handle this, or how we could take a book and get it onto the market. I have been coasting on that ever since. They were my mentors, and they were wonderful. And there was this time, probably in '69, that they, Jan, I guess, came in and said, you write a lot of poetry. I know you've studied poetry. You know more about poetry than we do. They were both shy of poetry a bit. And they said, take a look at these. Is this something that we want to publish? And I started leafing through these books, and I was thunderstruck, I must admit. Just brilliant, amusing, varied, marvelous sense of the language. You could just hear these people speaking, or you could hear his intonation just reading it. And so I got back to them in the next meeting, and I said, "We've got to publish these. These are amazing." But they said, "Well, okay, so now you want to do this. I want you to go up and talk to Bill Mundell and discuss how we're going to handle this, how we're going to choose which poems, and how we're going to put the book together." Okay, well, I had no idea. I mean, I had met Robert Frost twice and talked to him briefly, and was, as one would expect, because I was quite young, in awe of being with a poet with that kind of reach. Well, here was Bill Mundell with, as far as I was concerned, a very similar reach, that marvelous twinkle in his eye, the playing with language. And so I driving up there to the Mundell home. I must admit, I was a little bit nervous. What was this going to be like with this fellow who had written these amazing poems? And got up on his porch and was welcomed into the house, and from that moment was completely relaxed. He couldn't have been more charming. I was already in love with Vermont, but here was the sort of quintessential Vermonter with this tough but kind way of reaching out to strangers and getting them involved in discussing things. And so we discussed how we were going to proceed. And then I can't remember, he may have suggested that he had a lot of photographs, and perhaps we could use some of the photographs to add a little color to the pages, to the sense of the book. That would be my guess, that he made that suggestion. And I went back to Jan and Steve and said, that seemed like a good idea to me. So along came a sheaf of Bill's photographs, mostly black and white, but some in color. And I then took all of this to Bob Dothard, who was our wonderful book designer out in Guilford, one of nationwide standing, just an extraordinary book designer, and said, "Look, we've got these things." And he said, "Well, what do you want the book to look like?" And I said, "I want this book to be pretty enough so that if it's on gets face out in the bookseller, which was the Green's bookstore down here, tourists are going to say, 'Oh my goodness.' And then they're going to turn it over and they're going to say, 'That's this is something I want to take home. This is a picture of Vermont that and so we chose those photographs, and then going through, looking at other photographs, so many of them, the sense of people's faces, of characters that came through the poems, and the poems. His sense of photography was the sense of a poet. Frankly, the photographs are very powerful. The mood, the way he chose them, the angles and whatnot, just amazing as far as I was concerned. So we managed to bring the book out. And it did pretty well. And it was just about that time that I moved my career on, went up to SIT and became a language teacher, and left Jen and Steve. And one of the things that I regretted was that I knew there would be more Bill Mundell books. And there were, because Jan and Steve just loved working with him and with the work. And they had gotten a lot of positive feedback from having done it. And so I can't take any credit for all of the other books except loving Bill Mundell's work.
Thank you very much. More comments or stories from the panel? Or would you like to have us ask the audience if they have anything they'd like us to talk about? Sandy.
Talk a little bit about the writers' retreat.
Yeah, which I don't know a lot about, the Cooper Hill Writers Conference. When we started this project, Jerry Carboni and Sandy and I were sitting around in the Tulip Cafe, and Jerry's great at ferreting out historical stuff, and we didn't find much online, but there was a Cooper Hill, which is near South Newfane. It's kind of the next town. It's in Dover, right, or East Dover. And John and Miriam Andrews, who were poets, ran this writers' conference, which attracted a lot of participants. And Bill Mundell was, I don't know if he was officially a teacher there, but I think he led discussion groups and seminars. And in the talk I'm going to give later, I mentioned William Packard, who is a very noted poet in New York City, who met Bill Mundell because he came to that conference. And that's almost all I know about it. The Cooper Hill imprint is on the 4th and 5th books. Out of the 6 books were published by something called Cooper Hill Books. And that's obviously because Stephen Green Press was out of business at that point. And there was also a magazine called Poet Lore. And we've tried to find out much more than anything about that too. And but it was a magazine which I believe was affiliated in some way with that writers' conference, I think. And for a period of time, Mundell was the executive editor, and it published poetry that was submitted. And no one here seems to know any more about it, or maybe, yeah, Tim.
Yeah, it's known to be the oldest poetry journal in the United States, and it still goes on. It's centered in Washington, D.C. now. And John had been, I think, originally the editor when he moved up to Dover and the like. And I think maybe Bill might have taken over after that, I'm not sure. But it still exists.
Wow. Thank you.
I was hoping somebody would know.
Yeah. Back here.
I met Bill Mundell near the end of his life. I was living down the road in South Newfane at the time, and I was out campaigning with Dan Darrow, who was the representative for the area. And we stopped at Bill's house, and he was just as you describe him, just real generosity of spirit, incredibly friendly, brought us in, welcomed us in, told us all about himself, asked about us, really interested in everything and wanting to talk about things. But I remember specifically, there were 2 things that he seemed to take great pride in, and one was his poetry, and the other was the ski touring. And he indicated that he was one of the first people to actually set up a ski tow. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't sure if you know when he originally created his first ski tow and when that actually got started. But I think you said it was before World War II anyway, right?
Yeah. Bill was not the first ski tow in Vermont. Bromley was getting started at that time. Suicide 6 did predate it. And there were some other little ones. There was another one actually competing with him beside Prospect. And so he was not the first, but he was certainly one of the early ones. And he took it to a different level than some of the other skiers, and he was actively trying to learn how to do the new techniques of skiing. We would hear telemark, and we would hear this, and we would hear Christie, and we would hear this, and it would just be a continual education for those of us who were around him. And the people who came to the ski area did get some lessons, mostly free, but there was a pretty good bunch of skiers. There really were. There was a few folks that really took it to heart and did some studying, but there were books out there. This was before the Austrian technique came over here after the war. But there were a lot more Nordic skiing going. There was a lot more Nordic skiing going on a downhill slope than you can believe. But other than that, it was early. Let's make it work. That's the way it worked.
That's great. Over here.
In the slideshow, there's a picture he took of the ski toe line, and it'd be interesting if you look at it later, if you could say if it was his or some other area.
I think that's with a gondola. So
Not the gondola, the other one, which is the toe line.
we did put in try to get some skiing pictures in there. There was the carousel. The boxes of carousels. One says ski on it, so we figured we better use some of those.
One of the things that Bill had a lot of fun doing was going to different ski areas. Number one, to learn, but number two, to just enjoy himself too. And he and I took a lot of trips. We'd take a week, and I'd take a week of vacation, and he would take a week of vacation, and we'd just go. And we might head for Maine, and then go to New Hampshire, and then go back to Vermont, and drop up into Canada, and who knows what. It would just, wherever the skiing looked great, we would go there. But he got a first name basis with most of the people who were running the big areas. He was first name basis with the people running Killington. First name with Walt Schonkeneck. I mean, he got to know these guys, and he didn't always agree with them. Sometimes he disagreed heartily with them, but he had a good time learning how to ski and get along with these folks and see what they had and see what they could do different. He could do different.
Did he teach you to ski? Did he teach you to ski? Did he teach you to ski?
I don't remember learning to ski.
Well, as I'm hearing all of these stories, I'm struck by the community that he was living in. Jan and Steve Green were up in Dover, right on they owned half of Mount Pisgah, which was later, much to Jan's disdain, named after Farmer Snow, and became Mount Snow. And she said, no, it's Mount Pisgah. But anyway, they were really interested in skiing. They published Johnny Caldwell's wonderful book on cross-country skiing, and they were always meeting and working with skiers. They were involved in the early days of the George Washington ski race, and then I'm sure in that because Jan was a member of many of the ladies groups in the area. I'm sure that's probably how she met the Andrews. And I wouldn't be surprised if Mrs. Andrews or Mr. Andrews had said, you've really got to focus on the fact that this fellow that you've met, Bill Mundell, really has some wonderful poetry. I don't know how they first found out about it. Maybe Bill came and knocked on their door, but it was a close community for all those mountain towns.
Sandy.
Don, can you talk a little bit about the Life magazine?
Well, there is a copy over there, and and it's the cover is Frazier, who's the other fighter, and Ali, I guess. And so when you first see the magazine, you go, oh, this is what it's about. You have to get into it to find out. It's a 2-page. It's not a lot, but I guess it's a lot for somebody from Vermont in Life magazine. It's 1971, and the there's a 2-page spread, which is a photograph, which is one of the many that he did that's a composite of, as I said, it's like ice crystals and horses trotting. And then if you turn the page, and I set it up so that you can easily turn to the next page, it has a picture of Bill Mundell sharpening a scythe, which is a very characteristic thing for him to be doing, and a little bit about him, and then a bit of a poem, one of his poems about an old timer. So it's a nice treatment. And I don't know how Life magazine got a hold of that, or maybe. And he was published in the New Yorker poems and a bunch of other, in the Atlantic and so forth. So he did get some national attention. Anything else from our panel, or anything else from the, yes?
It's always struck me reading his poems, his intense sense of place.
Mm.
But it seems he knew every brook, every hill. I mean, he certainly knew every road from working on it, every hill farm that was kind of fading back, and talking lovingly of
Yes.
what was in the barn. The characters. I mean, it's sometimes fun to kind of chuckle. Oh, I know that road. I know, I know that curve in it or wherever. And it was just such an intimate knowledge. I just wondered if any of you could speak to that, just how thoroughly you just seem to know all the neighborhoods and yet again the hill farms, the characters who lived in there, and cherish them and recognize them as a disappearing breed.
I'll speak to that. That's what immediately grabbed me as I was looking at them for that first time, because he just had this intense sense of place, and I might say the spirits in the community, long time ghosts, whatever, spirits of the animals, both the wild animals and the farm animals and the horses. He loved them all, and that love echoes back, and it's inescapable in reading the poems, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Kind of a fun story of just, so we bought your grandparents' house. So we have his brother's house, so Meryl's dad's house. And so we inherited some of the books. And then I was buying some more books at Brattleboro Books, and found some of his books, bought a few others. And I opened one up, and there was a beautiful poem about your father and your grandfather that was written in eulogy to him about our house. And I don't know if you've ever seen, I don't know, I looked through the books and never saw it written, published, but it's beautiful. It's about the curve of the stair. Just they made the house come alive and what he wrote about what his brother had done in building the home. So I'll make sure you have it in case it's not.
Great, wow.
The family, but also his archive. I'm not sure it's in a book. Or you might have it. It's beautiful.
He was a really keen observer of nature and wherever he was. There's a photograph, I don't think it's on the slideshow, where he was standing in the water down in the brook with his camera, and the little shiners were around his toes, how shiners will, and he took a picture of it. It is a really interesting observation of just the way he thought. This is the little detail that's worth taking a picture of. That's just an example of the way he thought.
Well, I was just thinking what Sally said about how he gave things to people, like even after he passed on, that I opened up this book and it fell out.
Yeah, that's great. Anything else? I think we are pretty much ready to take a short break. And for those of you who have survived so far, in about 15 minutes, I will be reading a whole bunch of Mundell poems with commentary. And I'd like to thank our wonderful panel. This has been great. And once again, to thank the Literary Festival, Words Project, all the entities, the librarian who have been involved here. And mention that over here we have refreshments. and the exhibit. And in fact, it's interesting that Stephanie Green at one point called us up and said she had some photographs to give us, and she gave us a manila envelope of snapshots that looked like her. She said she thought one or both of her parents had taken them. And there are a couple of those on the black board there. And they're real, just family photos of people sitting on the porch and stuff like that. So it shows the relationship between the Greens and Bill Mundell. And while you're wandering around over on this table here where Evelyn is stationed, there are a few of the extant books. All the books are out of print, all 6 of the poetry books. So I happen to have some reason been hoarding some of them and decided I only really need 1 copy of each book. So we're selling those to benefit the Words Project and the Brattleboro Literary Festival. A couple of them are signed, and so I hope you'll peruse those. Also, when it comes time for my reading, all the poems I'm reading are in this little pamphlet here, because I think it's somehow a bit easier to follow a poem you may not have seen before when it's being read aloud, if you can read along with it. So thank you all very much. Thank you to all of you who attended, and please take a nice break, enjoy the refreshments, buy the books, chat, and for those of you, as I said, who are still here in a little while, Sandy will decide when it's time to get into the next part of the program. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. It's Don's turn now, and I've worked with Don for a number of years on the Words Project, like he said, and he is the most amazingly thorough, does such incredible work. It's just unbelievable. Don's mother was an author, and he received his AB degree with distinction in English language and literature from Boston University. He was a member of the Brattleboro Words Project Committee from the previous autumn project for focusing on Royall Tyler and Mary Palmer Tyler and then Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. And his play, which was co-authored with Christina Gibbons, True as Steel, was performed as part of the Tyler celebration in 2018. As a reader, he had delivered has delivered the annual Christmas story at Christ Church in Guilford since 1973. And he partnered with Guilford's Tom Regal on 3 programs featuring English and American poetry, including a selection of poems by William Mundell. He first met and interviewed William Mundell in the 1970s as co-host of WKBT Radio Art Scene, and then subsequently invited Mr. Mundell to read his poetry and showed his photographs in a class he taught in New England College, the New England Literature at Community College of Vermont. As a composer, he has set 9 Mundell poems. A song Crow Convention was performed by the soprano Evelyn McLean at the Poet Laureate ceremony for Mundell in 1989. And his setting of the 5 Mundell poems, Vermont Voices, was performed by the Piedmont Children's Choir on the West Coast and on tour in the UK. All the poems that Don is reading this evening are in the booklet you should have received. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. I have to get this microphone sort of out of the way of my speech here. So yeah, once again, this little booklet, which there are more copies of over here, I think you all have it by now, contains the text of all the poems that I'm going to be reading. And I was going to introduce Bill Mundell, but I don't think I need to because all of you are here for the other part. So I'm going to jump right in. And because Mundell was particularly demonstrative in his admiration for his near contemporary, the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, I'm starting our look at Mundell's poetry by citing one of Thomas's signature lyrics, poem in October, appropriately. Thomas's 30th birthday is context for his ascending to a hilltop overlooking his home village. His rich language and imagery was nurtured by the fact that his father often read to the family from the Bible, and we cannot miss the symbolism of poems placed on mountaintops. Just a little excerpt. It was my 30th year to heaven, woke to my hearing from harbor and neighbor wood, and the mussel pooled and the heron priested shore, the morning beckon with water praying and call of seagull and rook, and the knock of sailing boats on the net-webbed wall, myself to set foot that second in the still sleeping town and set forth. The reference to the still sleeping town emphasizes that the poet alone is seeing the town. Lamenting the passage of years, he remembers his childhood in this landscape. Then in the last stanza, he accepts the turning of time, knowing he will have to return to the town below. And the poem closes, "Oh, may my heart's truth still be sung on this high hill in a year's turning." It's always tricky to compare one poet's work with another's. Mundell may not have had Thomas's poem in mind at all when he wrote his signature poem, but he often cited his admiration for the Welsh poet. In any event, this poem is a marvelous reflection on Mundell's dual life as a poet and an active citizen. Hill Journey. The field-bound cattle, in the mirrors of their eyes, bear me up to the hunted hills, and would follow me over the wall and the topmost rail to hear the hillside wind go over the shed of pines and walk in the acorn fall on the runs of the deer. I am lost above orchard and field, and leaves like apples shaken by the wand of my hand fall to a carpet of light. I make songs out of the notes of ripe berries. I sit at the hallowed tables of unharvested stumps and drink from the earthen cup of the blue sky spring. I walk the round roads of fallen trees through valleys of fern and rest on islands of ledges above the waves of moss. I read the revelations of the day on parchments of the silver birches, and time sits with me in the hammocks of stone. I shall go down again to the valley of concern. I shall return to the rage of change, but it is today that is forever and forever, and I can hold the sun and the moment still in the wink of my eyes. We may also here give a nod to Dylan Thomas's other famous poem, Fern Hill, about his aunt's farm where he enjoyed happy childhood days, and note the reference in Mundell's poem to valleys of fern. These slight suggestions of connections to an admired poet should not divert us from the more important aspects of Hill Journey that truly define William Mundell. Lyric poets often observe and write about nature, but Mundell was of nature. He cut down trees, used horses, grew vegetables, sawed timber. In short, he was part of the landscape he describes. Many New England poets wrote about stone walls. Mundell built them. In Hill Journey, we find the poet involved. He makes songs out of the notes of berries, for example. This involvement of the poet with the natural world we will see again in further poems. This poem joins many of Mundell's in being a poem about place. Many poets write about rural places, but Mundell's are very much of his specific place, South Newfane, Vermont, and his home in the settlement of Brookside, where he was born, lived, and died. So important was this to the poet that he titled his third book of poems, Mundell Country, and the biographical note on the cover reads, William Mundell likes to say that he is definitely the best poet writing today in Brookside, Vermont, on the right side of the road between the 3 village mailboxes and the old Brookside schoolhouse. The inside cover of Mundell Country includes a map of the territory, the adjacent corners of South Newfane and Dover, Cooper Hill, home of the Writers' Conference, Newfane Hill, Hunter Brook. Also indicated are the sites of the subjects of many of the poems, the Gravel Pit, Gibbs Barn, the Logger's Shack, and Pearl's Walk. Mundell is usually quite content to be alone in his love for his place, but he does sometimes dig a bit at those who only give his territory a cursory glance, missing what lies beneath, as in this poem, The Strangers. By a sudden bend of the shadowed road, they came to the village, strangers aloof as the scudding clouds. The farms lay misty with the morning haze. The cattle grazed outward toward their midday pastures. The groves were sleeping like gardens in growing summer. Perhaps the visitors saw the wild geese in the swale at the edge of the marsh, or a cottontail leaving the traffic of the graveled way. They passed all the little roads leading back to the higher farms. They passed the small white church and the burial ground. Rounding another bend of the road, they were gone. They will not remember where they heard the loudest bird of summer, or remember the quiet town, or ever return. The Strangers shares with much 20th century Vermont literature the idea that rural life is vanishing, and Mundell returns to that idea from time to time. A major Mundell theme is that the casual consumer of nature misses the intricate society that lies beneath, in this case including the historical built landscape. We'll return to the idea about the secrets of nature in some of Mundell's most wonderful poems in a few minutes. Before moving on, an interesting note about this poem is the use and repetition of the word past. They passed all the little roads leading back to the higher farms. They passed the small white church and the burial ground. William Mundell admired the poetry of Emily Dickinson, one of whose most significant poems is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And so we're going to look at that a couple times, so I will read it for you. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews grew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So back to Strangers and the lines, they passed all the little roads leading back to the higher farms. They passed the small white church and the burial ground. And here we find a fascinating comparison between Mundell's use of past in reference to the features of the small town and these from Dickinson. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. And continuing this probable coincidence, we have Mundell's Strangers passing the church and burial ground. In the Dickinson poem, the narrator goes from passing these common village scenes to pausing, a variant on passing, before a mound of earth, which we understand also to be a burial mound. One more possible reference in Mundell's poetry to this Emily Dickinson poem occurs in one of the poems he read on the WNYC radio program, Sunride. In his steel-cold stable, I waited where his bridle hung, starred with jewels of dew. He moved to daisies one by one. As he lowered his head to the meadow's full manger, I saddled the sun. Gold road and dust of cumulus, we ran the hilltop islands on the morning's mist. Slanting, we plumed the high hawk's wings with sudden fire. Sparks from his hooves filled to floodmark rivers that streamed like ribbons in the valley's dark. Light from his glistening flanks revealed white mansions in the towering clouds. His head was toward the darkened sea. I leaped to paths where mottled shade wove on the northern slope soft carpet made with moss and lichens. From that low foliage rose pale mushroom moons. Wood shone and onyx glazed the common stone. So this may be another stretch, but look at the line, his, that is, the horse's head was toward the darkened sea. And then at the end of the Dickinson poem, 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day, I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. The constructions was toward and were toward, both referring to horses' heads, and the similarity of darkened sea and eternity are tantalizing analogs. But now to work. A number of Mundell's poems are about work, either his work or the type of work he did as a carpenter, stonemason, farmer, or one of his major occupations for many years as a highway foreman. He has poems about cutting firewood, carpentry, logging with teams of horses, butchering, and even one about writer's block. Two wonderful poems, including The Road I Mend, which is one of his finest, are about the work he did for many years as a state highway commissioner. It sounds like a desk job, but in Mundell's Vermont, a highway commissioner was likely as not to be in a ditch with a shovel. Irwin E. Brown, in memoriam, Road Commissioner, East Dover, Vermont. As on those nights I plowed the drifting roads, I have gone out and left the peaceful house, the love and warmth. I have gone on alone to mark and clear a path through storm and snow. I have gone on to lift away the drifts like clouds of disbelief. By morning, you will know that someone passed who peered all night into the tunnel of the storm. I leave the clean plowed road that you may see the hills and curves ahead. And many travelers will know I passed this way. This next poem is one of Mundell's finest, as he was meticulous in his photographs of ice crystals or in building a house for Marlborough College professor Richard Judd. Mundell brought exacting craft to his poetry. Each of the four stanzas introduces a common physical element of the road commissioner's topography: culverts, ditches, bridges, and macadam, giving each a shocking epithet: the eyes of Lucifer, veins of the demon. The parallel structure of each of the stanzas is virtuosic, and the musical language is masterful. The Road I Mend. Culverts, the eyes of Lucifer, cataracted with the rooty growth of bogs and black with the clotted blood of earth, stare blind. After the surgery of my shovel, I can see heaven through the hollows of his eyes. Ditches, veins of the demon, dividing with sinews of golden gravel, clogged with corroding clay, arteries hardened by indulgence. It is by the miracle of my hoe he lives. Bridges, satanic towers, the gates to high mountains and to wilderness, rise above gardens, kingdoms and slow rivers that could be mine, except the dust of my broom erases the promise. Macadam, the modern Styx, winds more than its 7 coils around the earth, carrying priests and carrying the profane to their journey's end. I serve the angels of light, and I serve the angels of dark, for this is the road I mend. Now we're into the heart of Mundell's poetry, and already you've sensed, for example, in Hill Journey, that a major preoccupation is with time. This is hardly an unusual theme or topic in poetry. From Time's winged chariot in Andrew Marvell to T.S. Eliot's still point of the turning world, poets have told us about time. As a modern poet, Mundell sometimes deals with the displacement, the shift of time. While a hallmark of 20th century poetry, prose, and drama, think James Joyce, think of cinema, some forward-looking poets of the previous century also explored time shift. We've already seen that one of several poets Mundell admired was Emily Dickinson, and once more looking at the remarkable Because I Could Not Stop for Death, we find the poet narrator is describing the present day, and in a cinematic flash, she suddenly says, "Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day." A contemporary of Dickinson's and a very different sort of poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, in one of his sonnets, talks of waking suddenly in terror in the black of night and finding time displaced. But where I say hours, I mean years, life. In the following Mundell poem, another poem about work, we may directly compare the Dickinson and Hopkins lines to Mundell's. Late farming. Through years and every season's need, your hands, now mine, still callous on the plow, broadcasts the seed. All days are one. It was today we reaped and gathered in, except the days are years. The barn looms dark and empty, and the chores are done. All days run backward toward the night. I follow, and each day I cross your days and spend the quick remaining light. A movement in modern poetry, surrealism, which flourished briefly after the First World War, and which we most associate with painting, involves irrational juxtapositions, and as we know from Salvador Dali's painting, involves the distortion of conventional concepts of time. As a young poet in the early 1930s, Dylan Thomas was captivated by surrealism, as William Mundell was by Thomas. One of Thomas's most famous poems is "And Death Shall Have No Dominion," a strongly surrealist poem whose final stanza is, "Though they be mad and dead as nails, heads of the characters hammer through daisies, break in the sun till the sun breaks down, and death shall have no dominion." And notice the appearance of the sun twice in one line. A blazing, scorching sun seems to be a frequent character in surrealist poetry, and I think in the following Mundell poem, its appearance may be a nod to that. This poem, another of Mundell's most stunning, reminds us that Thomas also has a major poem, "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night," addressed to his dying father. Before you go, for my father. Before you go where other suns raise Eden lush from golden seeds and weave it round you as a robe, walk once more on our barren hill. Oh, walk with me our field of weeds. Our scythes made fire on the stones, our wheels laid thunder on the road. Oh, lift once more that starry load, that building bent us toward the ground. Before you go where other suns attend the garden of your dream, remember here where shadows meld. There was that music of the stream. Some sunshine touched our stubble field. Notice that sun appears twice as well as sunshine. And Mundell also tantalizes us with a marvelous wordplay where sun, S-U-N, is an understudy for sun, S-O-N. Another word which turns up in this poem is scythes. In the striking line, our scythes made fire on the stones. The word scythe appears in at least 10 of Mundell's poems. On one hand, this may not seem surprising, as the scythe was a common implement in rural Vermont used for mowing, and during Mundell's lifetime, supplanted by motorized machines. The scythe has strong symbolic value as well. In Masonic ritual, it is a symbol for time which cuts the thread of life. In mythology, the scythe was the implement of Saturn, the god of time. We've all seen illustrations of time, an old bearded man with an hourglass in one hand and a scythe in the other. A related tool is the sickle, which we know as an emblem of time from the line in the Shakespeare sonnet, "Within his bending sickle's compass come." Scythes in Mundell's work certainly have this symbolic value, though, again, as a poet of rural life, his scythes are also generally the actual implement as well. Several references add sun and fire to scythes. The natural world is the foundation of William Mundell's poetry. It is practically required of a Vermont poet to use nature as a subject, but Mundell's poetry takes that usual sort of appreciation a step further in a series of poems which focus on nature in revealing detail. Mundell's expert photographs may provide an analogy. While many photographers capture the general beauty of a woodland stream, Mundell, using macro lenses, specialized in extremely close-up images of ice formation in those streams. Indeed, someone encountering those photos may be entranced by the intricate patterns without knowing exactly what it is they are seeing, as in the one on this easel here. In very much the same way, Mundell used his poetic lens to examine and reveal the intricate, hidden world of animals, including insects. He was unusually equipped to do this, spending his 84 years often in the woods, pastures, on hilltops, and in the streams of his native place. As a stonemason, he would lift a stone revealing an ant colony, or move a fallen log, greeting worms or beetles. As a hunter, hiker, and photographer, he knew the habits and habitats of deer and foxes. Several of Mundell's most splendid poems mine this theme, and he always included several of them in his public readings. In Rural Maze uses a fascinating and satisfying rhyme scheme in 9-line stanzas. In rural Maze, beyond their streeted hill, the farming ants have milked their aphis cows and turned them out to wild rose pasturing on leaf plateaus verdant with chlorophyll. Returning home by winding tendril ways, they daily now bathing in sun-rayed dew, and at one jutting crag's serrated base, they pause to view through morning haze the white-capped mountain of a daisy's face. They drink of nectar springs. Forgetting chores, they mine a likely hollow for bright gems of shattered beetle shells and insect wings. Searching the compass points of all outdoors, they learn the hiding place where spiders teach their artful weaving in the ambush grass. And daringly, they climb a laddered web beyond a staring spider's lethal reach to let a slow, bulldozing earthworm pass. They cross the canyon country of late rain on bridges built with beams of golden straw. And here, beside 10,000 caves, they find sunset approaches to a rock-vast plain. Meeting with friends, they stop to have a word in some old inn of rich decaying log. And leaving late, confronted by swift night, they hasten to drive home their waiting herd by glowworm beacons and by firefly light. Wonderful stuff. Another theme of these poems, and an important one to Mundell, is the idea that we humans can never truly know this hidden world. However, we also get a gentle message that the poet has glimpsed and even studied this realm, but suggests that we, or most of us, cannot. The repeated title words carry a bit of admonition. You never shall enter the soundless wood, beyond where one leaf falling builds hill-long a wave of pulsed alarm that stirs the sudden drum of partridges or prompts the shrill cry of the blue jay's call. You never shall enter the muted wood, beyond where snowflakes whispering teach laden boughs a gentle speech, where winds confined by frosty twigs conspire to make the hemlocks creak. You never shall enter the peaceful wood, beyond where eyes of sentinels scan down the hillside where you stray. You never shall climb to a hidden way or an unknown path to the secret hill. You never shall enter the silent wood, beyond where padded hooves of deer leap down the flower beds of spring, and snow upon the greening moss sings down the silver sluice of streams. A distinctive aspect of these poems is that they take us even beyond the poet's special insights into this world, allowing the reader actually to experience the world from within. Again, from the very title, we are cautioned that we cannot really know this world, and indeed are not only unwelcome here, but moreover, we cannot approach it without disturbing it and being detected. The uninvited. There is never an open door to the wild beast's home, and stepstones leading to their secret wood are watched by snails with horns and ants with wings. You are tripped by little things, a spider's thread that rings 100 leaf bells down their trails. A twig will break, and some old inching worm will turn his head, concerned because of all the needless noise you make. Your anxious shadow, like a nosing hound, will race with deer mice to their grassy nests, and headlong on the path you found, it will invade the deeper shade where partridge rest, and send them shuddering across the disturbed hill. You will be seen from mounds where hooded woodchucks cull their gravel acre, where from lonely cells they come to work their sparse monk gardens for their fare, where all the braided briars and underbrush guard the low runs used by the fox and hare. There is the open door, you'll say, pointing to where a wide space runs, an open corridor through pillared trees. Then you will know that squirrels claim the place by sudden show and chatter, and as though to mock your thought, they'll stir a noisy whirlwind in the leaves. Always you'll walk announced to hedgehog hovels. Your pace will be regarded from each wildcat lair. Your hour of coming will be drummed through all the forest rooms. Your show of strength will be considered from each hilltop tower. Your journey will be timed by beasts beyond your sight. And should you follow, though moving cautiously, the wary host, like startled deer in flight, will all go bounding back until at last they move into the trackless cover of the night. Another and delightful aspect of these poems is their gently comic anthropomorphic view of the society and industry of these creatures. They have stepping stones, a spider's thread is a telegraph line, woodchucks are gardening. And note that resonating last line, they move into the trackless cover of the night, which again reminds us that even if we think we have seen this world, it is closed up on us and we can't quite prove it was there. The important word trackless is significant because one of the chief methods which naturalists use to study forest animals is through their identifying tracks. If they're trackless, then how can we really know they were even there? Clearly, trackless is a significant word and concept to Mundell, who similarly uses it in the opening stanza of a poem about the Native American entitled Geronimo. Here then Mundell carries the idea of the secret native world of the animals to the centuries of unknown to us indigenous people. I was born to mountain springs, to flashing fish, to buck and doe, vanishing into the trackless night. These poems are central to Mundell's canon and are one of the most distinctive and unusual aspects of his work. We've seen that Mundell treats this subject with humor and by giving the animals and their social structure human attributes with a sympathetic touch. Here is a key poem in this vein, marvelously crafted with mostly short, brisk lines, often made punchier by quick returning end rhymes. As in other Mundell poems, there's the image of the natural telegraph or phone that connects our surface world to that below. Another range. If you could hear with a special ear the range of insect speech, oh, what a din, what a daze you'd be in, what things that range would teach. The crickety, crotchety, grumpy bugs shouting their woes in one voice, the gossipy, hoppity locust swarms, each singing the song of its choice. What scandal the grapevines must handle, what stories the fields must forget. And the truth of the matter, for all that clatter, you've heard but the least of it yet. One old Grandpa Spider lays right to the cider down at the sour apple bar. Some ants could be named and their ant parents blamed who carried carousing too far. They tiptoed home lightly for a week or more nightly under an anticing star. Two parties of mites are demanding their rights. Their leaders are acting like pests. Their slogans, "Be gone, leave the dead limb you're on," are taken as no idle jests. The mites fully plan to do what they can. They're hurrying not in the least. To move out, they say, in the world, the way is to get on the back of some beast. The hustle one sees at a workshop for bees is less to be specific than the queen desires of bees she hires, though their noise is terrific. Yet have no fear, if you could hear her busy foreman shout, it would be known that every drone will get his combing out. Such acting goes on at the aqua salon that boasts of the swamp's biggest band. Not half the crowd's able to get a floating leaf table, and toadstools are spread on the land. One termite turned green at the sights he had seen, but was taken at last by their tricks. He told his best friends, and the odd way it ends, they're all moving down from the sticks. If you would hear, place a listening ear to a waiting lily phone whose roots thread down in the underground to channels quite unknown. If you would hear, cup a listening ear for the drum of a beetle bone being struck by the wings of invisible things in a coded monotone. If a muffled roar you hear, or more in the range of insect speech, oh, what a din, what a daze you'll be in, what things that range will teach. In our opening poem, Hill Journey, Mundell sees that his life is divided between two worlds, as he is reminded he must leave his hilltop and return to the Valley of Concern, to attend a select board meeting, or to audit the town accounts, to end the life of an aged horse, or for a trip to the gravel pit. An entire and extensive branch of his poetry is devoted to this real world. He made portraits of townspeople in both the media of photographs and verse. And in contrast to the poems cited so far, we might be surprised to find that Mundell devoted a significant amount of his work to anecdotal poems in the classic Vermont humor vein. Mundell's portrait poems include vignettes of town characters. In the book Mundell Country, there are poems about Grandpa Evans, Mike of the Gravel Pit, Ray Annis, and this one, Mr. Hopkins. Joe, living alone, allowed old Fay to board the winter months with him. Fay, more of a tramp than a neighbor or friend to anyone, lived summers in deserted houses on backroad farms. They were his wealth after their worth was gone. Fay watched them slowly crumble into their cellars. He would grumble then and move his belongings to another shelter with a better roof. Fay's summers were not spent in idleness. He was custodian of wild berry patches, the gunny sack inspector of abandoned orchards. Sometimes he was a scarecrow, watching in the green rows of others' gardens. Sometimes he would tap a near maple and boil the sap in his tea kettle. There would be enough syrup for one breakfast. In the map of Mundell Country on the inside cover of the book, the poet shows where many of these townspeople lived or where an event took place. These portrait poems, written in a more casual, conversational style, serve as a link to the one poet whose influence on William Mundell is very clear, and which we may assume the 30-year younger poet would have acknowledged, Vermonter Walter Hard. Walter Hard was born in Manchester, Vermont in 1882, ran a drugstore and then a bookshop there. He served in both the Vermont House and Senate, was an editor of Vermont Life, and a columnist for the Manchester Journal. For his newspaper columns, he began writing short sketches in the form of poems of rural life. Many are touching views of small village life. Many are in the classic Vermont humor mode with the inevitable old-time Vermonter punchline at the end. Literary critics wondered whether his pieces, which had no rhyme or discernible rhythm, were really poetry. To many an eye, they only looked like poetry because of their short lines beginning with a capital letter. Hard's poems have an important place in Vermont literature, chronicling the now vanished life and characters of Vermont's villages and farms. William Mundell presumably knew Hard's work, and its influence on a subgenre of Mundell's poetry is unmistakable. A classic formula in a Hard poem is a description of the eccentricities of an old-timer. The fellows chewing the fat in the country store speculate about this character, and finally they have to grill the offender whose answer provides the punchline to the poem. Here's the second half or so of a classic Walter Hard poem, followed by two Mundell poems in like vein. We join the poem, the Walter Hard poem, An Isolationist, in progress. The poem has introduced Oliver, the last surviving farmer in his neighborhood, and continues. After his parents died, Oliver bought some acres up on the mountain adjoining his own land. He bought it cheap, and folks thought he was wise. Next, he bought some land on the other side that adjoined his pasture to the south. Then he bought a rock rib place north with nothing much on it but scrub pine. There would never be any good timber on it, not in Oliver's time at any rate. Then the opinion makers around the store stove began to wonder what had come over Oliver. He'd kept right on buying, first on one side and then on another. One day, when they heard his back line had moved again by the acquisition of more mountain land, Oliver dropped into the store. Old man Stevens decided he'd find out whether Oliver was plain crazy, as he suspected, or not. So he asked Oliver what he thought he was doing buying up all outdoors this way. Oliver looked over his glasses and said, "Don't like to have folks owning land next to mine, that's why." And here is Mundell's Both Sides. Sherman was high bidder on an old-style plow at the village auction. That started some of the Riverland farmers joking about his hill farm. One asked him, "Do you still plow with oxen?" They never could figure how his farm grew hay enough for his 20 cows. Another asked, "How can you turn a furrow without starting a landslide? A tumble of hay up there must look like an eagle's nest. Do your seed potatoes have eyes like a hawk?" That prompted Sherman to talk back. "I wouldn't swap for riverland," he said. "Land up there's worth double. I wouldn't own a field that didn't stand up so a man could farm both sides of it." And another Mundell in this genre, personal property. Not many people besides the town listers knew any reason to go up Cooper's Hill, especially in mud season. Those who never took the trouble missed a good view, missed more in not meeting old Cliff, and the chance of ever knowing anyone near like him were less than few. One spring, the listers said Cliff had the biggest and fattest pig they had ever seen. The next year they found he still had the same pig, thin as a rail, razorback and lean. "What goes on here?" one of them asked, knowing Cliff was near starved himself and hadn't earned a penny all winter. "That's the same pig you had last year." "Yep," said Cliff. "If I'm going to keep a pig, I might as well keep that one as any. I'm raising that one to eat myself, you see. I'm fussy about my bacon. I like it with a streak of fat, then a streak of lean." As with most modern poets, William Mundell has drawn poems from life, and we've easily identified Mundell himself as a highway foreman and in other occupations in his poems. There are autobiographical stories and poems about Petunia the dachshund and Miranda the black cat, both among his own pets. A few poems are about poetry, and though seldom about his being a poet, there is this amusing one which must have been taken from an actual occasion, visit at Mrs. Ford's. "Mother, he's going to read a poem just for you. You love poetry, don't you, Mother? Yes, you do. Remember, you wrote poems. You wrote too. Can you hear him reading, Mother? He's reading a poem for you. I know you sense the rhythm, the rhyme. Yes, you do. Remember, you wrote poetry too." Wasn't that thoughtful, Mother, that he came to read for you? Are you smiling to thank him, Mother? Oh, I know you do. One of Mundell's most powerful poems, which we must include in this survey, certainly has personal roots, Pasture for Old Horses. From their stalls, gaunt after their long labors, we led them out to the new pasture in the somnolent hills, unharnessed except for the weightless feel of the tight leathers, still in the burning of their flesh. We let them drink at the cool trough, and the water sang to their blood. The morning smoldered in such stillness their ears hurt, hunting the harsh word that we could not speak, and there fell funneled to their senses only the music. They came with a loose rein in their excitement, only stopping to gaze with wonder at the fresh wound in the hill's side. We removed their half-wanted and familiar bridles. They stood, pierced by the sudden strangeness. Our kindness spoke in the quick ending, except the bending and the slow shoveling. And the wound of the hill will heal, save for the rummaging of the red foxes. The reference to red foxes may remind us of a similar reference in Skunk Hour, A Red Fox Stain Covers Blue Hill, by Robert Lowell, a New England contemporary of Mundell's. Lowell is certainly different from Mundell, both in his life and work, though we often get glimmers of connection between poets working in the same generation and region. And this leads us to a Mundell poem, a grouping of 3 short poems, quite unlike most of his other work, and a bit, if momentarily, closer to the confessional poetry of Lowell and poets associated with him, such as Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. And that connection is heightened by the fact that these are hospital poems. William Mundell had some chronic medical problems and received treatment at Norwalk Hospital on Long Island Sound in Connecticut. One result was this set of poems, which are unusual among his works in their directness and spare quality. 3 poems, Norwalk Hospital. Requiem for a Fisherman. Rock him, cradle, boat, bed, back to the sea's escape, the seascape, the going out under the gull's cries, the night watch in the dim harbor. Let the uniform whitecaps be buoyant waves. Let the mind cast a net wrought of silkdar thread. The eyes haul in loaves, fishes, riches, moon gold from the sea's trough, a calm on the waters. Rock him, cradle, boat, bed, back to the sea's escape, the seascape, the going out under the gull's cries. View of Saco Sound. The harbor invites my gaze. I walk seaward along the curving sand onto the stepping stones of boats that move into the mysterious haze. I am invited to voyage, to find harbor in that distance. The nurse pulls the draperies silently as a far-passing train. Spinal Tap, the duck pond. Pools of darkness fill where light leaks from shimmering ripples that move on the mirror of the pond. I float mesmerized, knowing a false peace. The predator watches from a center of shadows. Lost light gathers in great owl eyes. Deftly, a talon pierces my spine. Earlier, we heard Merrill recalling that when they'd pile into the car for a jaunt, especially for Uncle Bill's favorite annual outing to the Rutland Fair, it was required that everyone speak in rhyme for the whole trip. Poets tend to relish playing with and manipulating language. William Mundell was particularly interested in the music of poetry, but he also liked to play with words as sound effects. Remember from high school English class that favorite term, onomatopoeia. Here are 2 of his most effective poems using words this way. In the first, he adds an additional wordplay in describing the mud as being knee-deep and using the phrase to suggest the sound of spring frogs. Knee-deep, 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 knee-deep. The cow is out, the peepers peep, knee-deep, knee-deep. The swamp is wide, the pasture's on the other side, knee-deep, knee-deep. But some deceive, a boy could wade, but don't believe. She's over there, the cow is found, knee-deep, knee-deep. Better go round, better go round, better go round, better go round, echoes the sound. She's over there, the voices now, Dan Dow, here is your cow, Dan Dow, your cow, she's there, one leap, better go round, knee-deep, knee-deep. And at the other side of the year, a song for autumn, Crow Convention. Talk, 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 colder tomorrow, light as not frost, black as a feather. Shock, 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 piled in the cornfield. There is your warning of used up weather. Stalk, 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 goldenrod waving. Jensen's are bright October blue. Walk, walk, walk on the stubble of harvest. Wings to the south, summer is through. Ba, 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 sheep on the short feed, nibbled close as a stone to the ground. Ah, 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 the moon is brighter. Mornings are later in getting around. Haw, 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 leave the fields lonely. Let scarecrows stand in gardens of snow. Caw, 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 sun and the southland. Warn all the valley, tomorrow we go. And there are a number of other Mundell poems in which word acrobatics predominate, even sometimes over-meaning. Mundell was an accomplished craftsman, whether photographing ice crystals on streams, building a stone foundation, or writing a poem. Using our high school English class guidelines, we may survey the tools and techniques Mundell employs in his poetry. He often used free verse and was equally at home in iambic pentameter blank verse, as in Irwin E. Brown in Memoriam. As on those nights I plowed the drifting roads, I have gone out and left the peaceful house. Mundell uses all the classic poetic metrical units of verse quite consciously for various kinds of effect, notably spondees, the shrill cry of the blue jay's call, and dactyls, including the technique of combining the two. You never shall enter the soundless wood. As in much poetry, rhyme is an important element in Mundell's work. Just as he moves from free to structured verse, as he moves from poem to poem, Mundell has poems where rhyme, strictly speaking, is not present, and in other poems, a conventional rhyme scheme is. Through years and every season's need, your hands now mine, still callous on the plow, broadcast the seed. And as we saw a few moments ago, quick end rhymes are virtuosically used. If you could hear with a special ear the range of insect speech, oh, what a din, what a daze you'd be in, what things that range would teach. Internal rhymes abound in this poetry, and I'm leaving it up to you to scan the next passage in the little booklet, Watched by Snails and so forth. I've italicized the rhymes, all these internal and end rhymes, to help you find them. And as with his use of words in general, Mundell often handles rhyme like a juggler. Back to the seascape, the seascape. And as in Emily Dickinson, that poet that Mundell listed as among those whose work he admired, near rhymes are often found. Talk, 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 shock, shock, shock. Mundell does not tend to work in the neoclassical form of heroic closed rhyme couplets. Among many rhetorical elements Mundell uses, he's particularly fond of parallel constructions in the opening lines of stanzas within a poem. The most memorable example we saw in The Road I Mend, culverts, the eyes of Lucifer, ditches, veins of the demon, bridges, satanic towers, macadam, the modern Styx. In one of the poems Mundell chose to read on the WNYC interview, this poem, which I won't take the time to read, but I'll let you add it, you can notice that the repetition uses the title of the poem in each of the lines, the first lines of each stanza, which I've italicized. So sing the sun down, chant the sun down, dance the sun down. William Mundell revels in the use of form, and he was surely a student of the classic poetic forms, but he doesn't use them often. In all his published poetry, I found no examples of villanelle, and in the published poetry, we encounter but one sonnet at Barber's Point and one poem in the complicated sestina form, Revelation 20. But these poems tend to be less successful, so obviously he liked inventing his own form, a tenet of modern poetry, by the way. Here's a final look at the poets Mundell particularly admired and the influences they may have had on his poetry. In his foreword to Mundell's second published book, Plowman's Earth, his friend and former Marlborough College professor Richard M. Judd, one of very few academic commentators on his work, cites a number of earlier poets as being of interest. He names three favorites, Burns, Emily Dickinson, and Dylan Thomas. He reports that Mundell could readily quote the critical dicta of modern masters like Pound and Eliot, but his feel for the rhythms and flavors of poetry has developed from his own reading evidenced by the ease with which he can recite from memory such classics as Spenser and Shakespeare. He must also have absorbed a bit from contemporary poets who participated with him at the nearby Cooper Hill Writers' Conference. And as an editor on Poet Lore magazine, he would have been aware of various currents in modern poetry. We have noted his admiration for Dylan Thomas and Emily Dickinson, and generally, Mundell's poetry doesn't remind us of Dickinson stylistically, but there turns out to be in his work this very Dickinsonian little verse. 3 of us. I came to visit me today, but was not home, and no civility was shown by me, who other days I have walked with in all familiar ways. For me, I shall arrange the room another way, and to surprise me, I shall stay to speak to my lost kin. But someone knocks. Myself. Stranger, come in. One of the few scholars to take note of William Mundell was poet and editor William Packard, who taught at the New School and New York University, among other institutions. Packard participated at the Cooper Hill Writers' Conference, founded by John and Miriam Andrews. At Cooper Hill, Packard met William Mundell and gained an appreciation for his work. Here is the main paragraph from William Packard's introduction to Mundell's 5th book of poetry, A Book of Common Hours. What I especially value in Bill's poetry is an occasional fierce lyric intensity that results in a magical fusion of image and sound and voice. When this happens, it transforms the rustic bucolic into an extraordinarily sophisticated composition that has more to do with the art of someone like Hart Crane than it has to do with poets like Edwin Arlington Robinson or Robert Frost. In other words, the regionalism that most people praise in William Mundell's poems is only a front for the real work that is being done, which approaches a vision in which image and language somehow coalesce, just as it does in the work of Crane. Packard's identification of American poet Hart Crane, 1899 to 1932, as kin to Mundell is telling. Crane's heightened and exuberant language must have resonated with Mundell. We know that he knew Crane's poetry because of the unmistakable reference to Crane's epic poem, The Bridge, in which the Brooklyn Bridge is a metaphor for the vastness of America. Mundell did occasionally travel from his home base in Newfane, and his 4th published poetry collection, Finding Home, contains poems from other places in America. Among these is Walking Brooklyn Bridge. Not only is the title a giveaway, but Mundell's poem includes reference to Pocahontas, who is prominent in the Crane poem. And the final lines seem a possible gesture to the famous lines from a section of Crane's Voyages, which read, "Bequeath us to no earthly shore until is answered in the vortex of our grave the seal's wide spindrift gaze toward paradise." So here is Mundell's Walking Brooklyn Bridge. From these high eaves, I see the cities of the world, their commerce netted in the harbor's folds. A silver seaplane breaks from the web of cables and is free. Winds of traffic strum the tightened cords. In westward haze, Pocahontas still dances down the quivering light. I touch white strings that loose the arching roadway on its flight, threading the needle eyes of granite towers. You, on frantic wheels, helpless to flee the funneled traffic's siren song, and I, this moment thralled pedestrian, must know that in the tide's tall marsh below, some wondering turtle fixes our imperfect image in his gaze. Packard specifically points out the distinction between Mundell and the 2 major New England poets of the previous generation, E.A. Robinson and Robert Frost. When poetry readers learn of a 20th century native and lifelong rural Vermont poet, carpenter, and stonemason, who, moreover, was involved with a writers' conference, they understandably think of Frost. We can be grateful that credentialed academic William Packard headed off such a distinction. Mundell, to a greater extent than most poets of his caliber, actually lived the life and did the work that he wrote about, although we do recall that Frost did some poultry farming in his early career. But Mundell is unusual in having continued to work in carpentry, highway maintenance, and other trades all his life. As well, his service as a selectman and justice of the peace placed him firmly in the small town society of his humorous, anecdotal poems and in the company of his portraits of town characters. While admittedly sharing much of the same territory with Frost, he is aesthetically in a different stream of modern poetry. True that when he is channeling Walter Hard, Mundell easily slips into the role of the folksy Vermont wit. But his major work, as we've seen, is in the tradition of Dylan Thomas and Hart Crane, with its heightened language and rich orchestration. We conclude our visit with Vermont's finest native poet, with the poem that is often cited as being most appropriate as his elegy. Mundell's Inheritance also echoes that other Thomas elegiac poem we cited earlier, Do Not Go Gentle, with an echo of the Thomas poem in the first line of the Mundell. But equally important, Mundell moves in his personal way to the everyday, the specific, to his favored animals, old paths, stone walls. Tellingly, there are the valued and much used tools, again, the scythe and the carpenter's implements. In a short, compact, and masterful poem, William Mundell sums up his life and work. Inheritance. Do not let diminished light fall into that frame of shade where the cat lies in the sun. Do not let the porch flowers wither. Push back the rocking chairs just enough that in case of rain, they will not be spattered or rock empty in the wind. Say you saw the horses running side by side in the field, that the old red and white Ayrshire still enjoys her grazing. Look for the old paths, the stone walls, the maples. You will find the barn empty of worth, full of scythes and tools, the passed-on accumulation of lives. Notice that I had been there and left some things undone, that a square and a pencil still lie on the stallhorse. Say it looked as if I would be coming right back. Thank you very much.